59 counties to make this determination.
So if we said if something happens to the system, use your emergency ballots, wouldn't that be doing the same thing?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I mean, so because basically what you're saying is that you mentioned long lines, which I didn't understand what that had to do with the machines either. But it seems as though what you're saying is we don't have a plan in place. Should the machines go down or something happen to the machines?
Let me try that again.
Yeah.
You do have a plan in place.
Okay.
But it only gives examples of a limited number of things. For example, it says you can use emergency ballots if the lines go 30 minutes. You can use emergency ballots if the power goes out. You can use emergency ballots if you come in and the verification codes aren't working and the screens won't pull up the right ballot. But there is nothing that specifically says, oh, if you can't meet the ballot secrecy requirements, if you cannot meet the federal laws, if you cannot meet the law on testing.
What would be the reason for them not being able to meet those? What's the reason?
Well, on the ballot secrecy, if you have voted in person as opposed to voting at home, you see the bright, big screens and your vote ends up being displayed to people who are looking on.
So basically you're saying that the hand marked ballots should come into play if you walk into your polling place and you see the machines are up?
No, I would expect that today, even before you all make any types of rules on this, that the counties would recognize, look, we're not able to protect people's ballot secrecy, not with all of these machines. Therefore, what we need to do, because we're bound by the Georgia Constitution, bound by federal law and state law, to give absolute secrecy of the ballot, where no one can see how anyone else is voting. Therefore, we, the county, are going to honor that right. And the only way we can do it is only use a limited number of BMDs, and we will then use hand-marked paper ballots at private voting stations. See,
that's where that right there is where I get confused, because you're saying we're not legislating, but we'll be giving the counties the authority to circumvent the law.
Not to circumvent the law, to honor the law. Because if we look okay.
I understand the nuances. What I'm saying is it's still that. It's basically saying we walk in here, we see that these machines are, the screens are too big and people can see how people are voting. So now we're going to shut the machines down or have limited machines, but mostly on paper ballots. And that's up to the county's discretion. That's what you're asking.
Well, that's what this board has been saying, that it would be a county level decision. We are saying it needs to be a statewide decision, and you need to tell the county.
I think didn't you just say that it would be up to the counties to determine whether or not they go
under
through
the current interpretation. I was explaining what the current interpretation is. We're recommending that you go ahead and tell the counties. It's clear. If you know you're not going to be able to honor ballot secrecy, it is fine. You go ahead and set up your polling places for hand-marked paper ballots, because the way you're describing that, it is not a law in isolation that you use BMDs. You use BMDs only if they honor all the other laws. BMDs don't trump everything else. We got to honor people's right to a secret ballot.
That's why I think this should be taken up with the legislators, because what you're saying is you're telling the legislators that the machine it's not constitutionally honor the law.
No. The legislature, when they told Secretary Raffensperger to buy BMDs, they made a very specific requirement and said, and those BMD, you need to buy BMDs. Okay, we all agree with that. But those BMDs must provide absolute secrecy. Those are the words of the legislature, that no one can determine how someone else voted. But Secretary Raffensperger did not follow the General Assembly's law. They did not follow his instructions. They also said, your machines have to be able to be tested so that every single race, on every single ballot style, on every single touchscreen must be tested. It's infeasible with the current system. He chose a system that did not comply with what the General Assembly told him to. So you all are now caught in the situation where which law are you going to break? So we're saying, don't break any of the laws. Do what the General Assembly said.
Okay.
Okay.
I got it.
Do what the General Assembly said, and is if you can't honor the law, then use backup balloting.
Were all of these arguments not articulated before the General Assembly when some of this legislation was being, in fact, members of the General Assembly are here and they're nodding. They've heard these arguments and they chose not to act on it.
No, that's incorrect. The General Assembly said, we aren't talking about whether or not the choice of BMDs was correct. That is not what is before you. That is not what we are arguing here. The General Assembly gave instructions. They said, buy BMDs, but they have to provide for absolute secrecy. They said they have to honor LAT. You have to honor federal law. And Secretary Raffensperger's choice disobeyed the orders of the General Assembly. And that's why we have the problem we have.
5 years ago. And the General Assembly has met since 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. So
And
they have
didn't
met,
change the
and they
law.
have heard these arguments and they have chosen not to act. And we cannot act beyond the authority that we have been given by the General Assembly with their laws, and including the law this year that did not revoke the BMD requirement.
Right, and
I will not, I'm not opining on their policy choices there. I would have made other policy choices throughout this whole process. But I cannot, as an attorney, having sworn to uphold the law, exceed the authority that has been given, the very limited authority that has been given to us as a board.
And we would be the first to say you should never do that. We are asking you to honor the law because the General Assembly said, and it can't be refuted, the General Assembly said in House Bill 316, when they put in BMDs, they said, and they must provide for absolute secrecy of the vote, right? They did say that in HB 316. And they said you have to be able to do the full LAT testing. They didn't need to change the law. Yes, they've heard these arguments, but they did not need to change the law. They had already established the correct law. We would not have wanted them to change the law. On those points, we need to have the right of absolute secrecy. We need to have the LAT processes fully done. We need to honor federal HAVA that says the voter must be able to verify the vote they are casting. We're not asking in any way that this board exceed its authority. And I would go back to my proposal here of let's get something out there for public comment so that these kinds of debates can be settled rather than waiting till we get to a few weeks before the election and finding out we've got a compromised system and no solution.
I can promise you I've received about 250 emails in the last 48 hours and it's been a lot of public comment.
Right. I mean, for formalized public comment. And I forgot
I have to tell you, there are a couple of sentences in this temporary rule that bother me, and it would be the first sentence of paragraph E, where you talk about the Dominion ICX vulnerabilities and a report by the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency.
Yes.
And unauthorized distribution of Georgia Dominion voting system. I don't think it's this board's responsibility to give any validity to that in a rule. I mean, it is what it is, but to have that in a rule, I have a problem with that. And it's also included in subparagraph 8, I guess, E8, where you talk about this Dominion ICX vulnerabilities and all.
Right.
And I just think that's, for me, that's inappropriate to have that in a rule. So
I would normally agree with you. Absolutely. And I think it's too specific to have in a permanent rule. But because we have had a acknowledged problem and this is the temporary rule, we know this is a problem that exists. So we wanted to say, this exists. Let's have a temporary rule. Let's deal with the problem we've got in front of us with a compromise system. And when that mitigation is done, hopefully before 2026, then we get rid of this rule.
yeah, I don't think it's this board's responsibility to acknowledge things like that in a rule. And I understand it's a temporary rule, but temporary rules are printed and put in a book, and it is, it's there forever. So
Okay.
that's just a small issue I have with this. Are there any
Okay.
questions from the board?
I had one other thing that I forgot to respond to Ms. Gazelle. The public comment process, and some of the public may not know this, but in the public comment process, once you initiate rulemaking and you've got your 30 days, there is a copy of the proposed rule that goes to the legislature for this very purpose. It goes to the legislator. The two standing committees review the proposed rules for the purpose of saying, okay, you've exceeded the authority or you're coloring outside the lines of what we ever intended for you to do. So that if the General Assembly believes that in some way this is not consistent with the principles and laws they've laid out, that is their opportunity to say it in that formal rulemaking process. So that is what we would propose. Let's get something so that they can respond on this question of, is it outside the law?
Member Johnson?
Yes, a few thoughts. One, there was a huge response generated by this petition. And I thank everyone who saw fit to send us emails. I believe there were emails from Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, many people that supported this rule and many people that opposed it. But whatever, I appreciate the comments and responses. First question is, was this posted for review on our website? The temp?
No, the temp was not. No.
It was not. Okay. So that is a little bit of concern. In the comment about our voting method, we came from 17 years of using DREs, and which is a direct recording electronic voting system with no paper, essentially, to Dominion, which is sort of essentially, in effect, a fancier type of DRE. And we do produce a piece of paper that's called a ballot, but paper that is printed looks nothing like a ballot. And it does not, it's not easy for the voter to review. And it's downright impossible for many voters to remember all the choices that were on the original ballot. So just a critique there for me about the current system that we have. Now, as far as the cybersecurity and hacking, as far as hacking, it's not a matter of if a system gets hacked, it's a matter of when. And this past year, 4 counties, election computer IT systems have been hacked. And certainly every time I read about it, it raises a concern that it was a backdoor entry into our election system in some way or another, whether it's the voter rolls or into the county's election software and systems. So that is a constant concern. And since you haven't brought up the cybersecurity part of your petition, I guess I will refrain from other questions about that, but I just wanted to mention that. When there are issues with ballot designs, whether if it's an electronic ballot and there's a mistake, it is a big problem because one has to go back either to the original ballot build, which is a big deal. And I know the Secretary of State's office does not like that. Or sometimes they try to do a patch, which may or may not work or may create sort of a disaster of an election result. If there's a mistake on a paper ballot, it's visible, it's a piece of paper. The voter has that paper. The election officials have the paper. They can see the mistake. If there's time to send it back for printing corrections to provide the correct remedy, it can be done. But there's also options if there's not enough print time to provide a remedy for the voters by putting signage in the polling places. But an electronic ballot creates a lot of problems if there are mistakes on it. And it's either difficult or impossible for a voter to say, hey, there was a mistake on that ballot on the BMD, because they don't have the BMD in front of them anymore. It's gone blank. And they have this piece of paper with a summary of their votes. And they're saying, well, I didn't think I voted for that person, or who is that other? I don't think I saw that other candidate on the ballot. So it's a chronic issue, design issue problem. Now, as far as hand-marked paper ballots, there's not a thing wrong with a state, a county, or the country using hand-marked paper ballots. In fact, most states and most voters in this country vote with hand-marked paper ballots. We in Georgia think everybody votes like us on a machine, but most people in this country vote with hand-marked paper ballots. Now, in Georgia, a lot of us do vote on hand-marked paper ballots, absentee by mail. So we really have a two-vote method going on, not to mention UOCAVA and what goes on there as far as their voting method. So all that being said, I'm not afraid of hand-marked paper ballots, but the Secretary of State is the chief election official in this state, and it's the Secretary of State that decides the voting system that we use. And I would prefer the Secretary of State would declare that decision to transition to hand-marked paper ballots. But that's his decision. It's not mine. And I don't think it's within the authority of this board to make that decision. I think that's properly a legislative decision to be made. So, thank you.
Okay. And again, we're not asking you to do that. We're asking you to, just as you said, hey, if the lines are 30 minutes long, you're not changing the voting system. You're saying if the lines are 30 minutes long, you can use hand-marked paper ballots. We're saying also include if the voting system cannot honor secrecy, if the system's been compromised as it has, then use the hand-marked paper ballots. You know, the Morgan County Democrats Democratic Committee are co-petitioners here. Jean Dufour is here with some comments about the cybersecurity. If you can hear her, I've hogged all the time. And can you hear her?
If she can keep her comments brief, yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll sit right here.
Thank you very much for hearing us. My name is Jean Dufort, and I am here on behalf of the Morgan County Democratic Committee. I'm the chair of that committee. Recently, I enjoyed breakfast at the Madison Waffle House. And being the election nerd that I am, I found myself pondering what Waffle House and elections have in common.
I do too.
Yep. Well, here's the thing. They both operate in a lot of locations, almost 2,000 for you, about 3,000 for Georgia elections, and both rely on an army of about 30,000 relatively low-paid workers to get it done. And we have high expectations, both of us, for those workers. They also both handle electronic equipment and software. In Waffle House's case, for cash registers and inventory control. I'm a recovering retailer, so I understand multi-location things. And in the case of the Georgia election system, it's for votes and tabulation. But only one currently has procedures in place for what to do that require swift reporting, swift action, securing the system if there's a breach. A year ago, I stood in front of this body, very different people in the seats today compared to a year ago. And I was representing a broad coalition, the Morgan County Dems, but also Republicans, Libertarians. There was a wide group, independents, who all said, please secure the election. And please do it by putting in rules. And please do it by recognizing that unmitigated cyber attacks and vulnerabilities, unmitigated, present a very legitimate reason to go to the backup balloting system that the legislature put in place. We keep talking about changing the intent of the legislature is very clear. When the legislature prescribed the use of touchscreens as a primary system, it said only as long as it complies with all other statutes, including this and that and the other thing. And if it doesn't, go to your backup system. The reason they haven't acted in 4 years is because the rules are already in place. The instructions are there. We have just stubbornly refused to recognize that it is an equal act of common sense to take the touchscreens out of play when they're vulnerable, when they're documented vulnerable, right? Our cybersecurity agency is what we as a nation entrust as being the ultimate authority of that. And they said, yes, this is real to you. That's the purpose of that letter. They said, yes, it's real. So to fail to acknowledge that is to, put ourselves with no training ahead of our nation's highest cybersecurity agency. And a year ago, this body promised to act by December of 23, and it didn't. It kicked the can down the road. And as Dr. Jan said, 4. A month ago when I was going to talk to you, it said 3. One more, Dougherty County, Albany, has happened in the month since your last meeting. There's a trend line here of actual cyber attacks on our counties that in many cases have caused us to try to separate the voting system from everything else to protect it. And we don't know that we did that because we know, at least in the case of Coffee County, they spent days denying that it had happened, even to the Secretary of State. There is a problem here. But let me switch gears. Morgan County Democratic Committee, that's our leadership team. We made a unanimous decision to stand here in front of you today and set an example. Because we can all agree that there has never been a lower overall trust between parties, between candidates, in election systems. Trust is a really big problem, and it's growing, it's not shrinking. And we made a conscious decision to stand here to say, we don't have to trust one another to recognize a right policy move, to invoke the backup balloting system that the legislature prescribed when it's unsafe, impracticable, infeasible to use technology that's been compromised. And we agree on that across the aisle. Democrats agree on that. Republicans agree on that. Independents agree on that. They say we don't want a repeat of the controversies of 2020. We don't. And the best way to do that is follow the law. Follow what the state legislature told you to do. But somebody's got to say that out loud, and we propose that that body is you. It is, I would use the word impracticable, when it's a statewide breach and a statewide vulnerability to depend on 159 different county superintendents to wake up one day and take a vote. That's impracticable. And we have given you information about how courts have decided that. And that says you're in that chain of authority that can trigger that call. We've provided you the references for that. So here's from a Democratic committee. I'll put my partisan hat on for a minute in case it wasn't clear that I'm standing with you with that hat on, right? Here's the 4 buckets of risk we think remain if you don't act. Because, you know, we've all been playing, waiting for Judge Totenberg to do the things in her lane about the constitutional question. We've been waiting for Raffensperger to mitigate something. He hasn't done that, Secretary Raffensperger. So you guys are the last guys left standing, and there's 70 days left until the first vote is cast. So the clock is running. It is time to quit kicking the can down the road. So here's the 4 buckets of risk we see. We think that the state legislature may convene to say our elections weren't trustworthy because of mitigations, because of this and this rule violation. We think they're not trustworthy. We're going to decide to put a slate of electors in, or we're going to resolve controversies for the seats of representatives and senators, which under the law they do, right? An election challenge goes to the court and it comes back to the body to decide who's going to be seated. We think that there is far more basis for those actions than there was in 2020. And we saw what almost happened in 2020 in Georgia. We think that the courts will consider these unmitigated vulnerabilities and these other legal violations. And they may find differently when court cases come before them than they did in 2020, when the system hadn't been stolen and the vulnerabilities weren't documented, including by CISA. We think that partisans will use the touch screens in the polling places to wave around evidence of flipping votes. Easy to do with touch screens, impossible to do with the backup balloting system. And we think there could actually be cyber attacks. And it's not us. It's 29 cybersecurity experts. Our country's smartest people in this space have all warned us. And who are we to say we know better? I believe experts. That's my University of Chicago training. My Republican colleagues may even have other fears that I haven't named, but that's the thing about unmitigated risk. It fuels fear and mistrust. And the benefit of using our backup balloting system is it takes that off the table, because with a trustworthy ballot, with the ballot that is marked by hand, all the rest of the checks and balances can work. And audit works with a trustworthy ballot. You can audit an untrustworthy ballot all day long. And I'm sorry, in theory, we can try to train all voters to check their ballots, but the science says most don't. Most are bad when they try. And the most important and of that is, as we saw in Northampton, Pennsylvania, poll workers have no good options, even when a voter says this machine didn't work right. They just don't. Joseph Kirk is here. I've heard, well, when the third report on any particular machine comes in, we take it out of play. Right? Really? That's a plan? So poll workers have no good options when the system's been compromised and the ballot is untrustworthy. So could it be an unfunded mandate? I've heard that. We haven't talked about that today, but it's the opposite. And use your common sense. We already have a full ballot system. So you're replacing a precinct printed ballot with a pre-printed ballot, probably a wash, right? But the real savings come in labor and related costs when you don't have to program, provide logic and accuracy testing, or transport and set up and take down about 80,000 touchscreens, printers, and UPS units. A lot of labor savings. Elections are our public treasure. I urge you, you are the last men and women standing between an election that's going to be run on a system that has been compromised. It has been compromised. If your bank told you your credit card was compromised, but we can't get you a new one for a month, you wouldn't like it. It would be inconvenient, but you wouldn't insist you keep using it until they can replace it. You would shut it down. And that is really the best analogy I can give you to where we stand today. And the benefit is you'll restore trust in elections. And I implore you to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the board? Chair will entertain a motion on this petition. Before we make a motion, I would like to, for those new attendees today, when the board votes on this, the board has 3 options. The board can accept the petition and initiate rulemaking procedures. the board can deny the petition or the board can table for further consideration to a later date. And in those cases, it's often assigned to a board member to work with the petitioner to try and revise the petition if necessary. And so those are really the three options that we would go down. The board would entertain a motion, and the chair would entertain a motion at this point.
I move that we reject the petition.
We have a motion from Member Gazal to reject the petition. Do we have a second?
Yeah, I second.
We have a motion and a second from Member King to reject this petition. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor of rejecting this petition signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Hearing no nays, so move this petition is rejected. Thank you. Ms. Marks, I believe that you're up again. Petition for amendment. It is tab number 3 for the board.
Okay, and there was a handout as well. Do you have that?
Do we have a handout?
Yes.
Oh, is that the,
It
Okay.
says,
all right.
it looks like this. And this board heard this rule in May, and you said you needed some more time to go back and look at details. And so maybe what we'll do is cover these slides very quickly, cover the 2 things that we changed since May, and see what questions that you have. As we count ballots in Georgia, today it is a combination, as it always should be, of hand counting and machine counting. Our pre-election logic and accuracy test, you do hand counting to make sure that the machines are accurate. Our official count is by scanner tabulator machine count. Post-election auditing is manual count to make sure that the machines got the right outcome. The official recount is by law to be a manual count. But unfortunately, there was a rule put in place some time ago that says that it is being done by machine. We want you to correct that in our proposal. That's why we're here. And so, to be clear, we are not trying to debate machine count versus manual count. The accuracy and efficiency are optimized when we have hand counts and machine counts side by side, with hand counts verifying what the machines have done. Certainly a waste of resources to try to manually count all of the ballots in all the precincts. After all, we've got about 50% of the state races this year that are not even contested. It'd be an enormous waste of resources to count those ballots by hand. And so we are not here saying that you should count all races by hand. Machine count should be the first official count, and the law says that recounts, because you are now within 0.5% of the machine count was in 0.5% in terms of the margin. Now let's make sure that the machine's counted right. Did it see all of those light marks? Did it see the marks that were made with a red check rather than black ink? Let's make sure that it was not hacked. It wasn't misprogrammed. That's why the law says we should be doing manual counts to check the machines on the official counts. Audits only test a small number of elections. We can't rely on audits to do the recounts for us. On the page that has 2 columns, there seems to be endless debate, and for possibly good reason, on the way that the 2020 election was counted. And, you all have been dealing with the petition or the complaint on that. that complaint wouldn't even exist had there been manual recount as the law required. Because rather than having machine count that was not overseen very well, or the audit that had at best a lot of sloppiness and no real good procedures, there would have been a manual recount. Each campaign would have had a seat at the table as a counter. It would have, a counter would have handled every single ballot. Any questions about the validity of the ballot could have been dealt with then in a public forum. I say a public forum, in public observation is really what I mean. The ballot tallies would have been much more transparent. And we wouldn't be dealing with controversies today over whether or not those ballots were counted correctly, because those campaigns would have been appointing those counters, and it would have been done very transparently. So I think we can see why the General Assembly said they wanted Georgia to use manual recounts. In our rule, we propose that, sure, use machines if you need to assist in that recount. If you're having discrepancies, put the ballots back through the machine if you want to. If you're having discrepancies, they can sometimes help you find the discrepancy. Since the time you heard this rule in May, we made a couple of changes based on our experience in observing the recount in Coffee County. And one was, we watched discrepancies being made in the manual count in LAT. Actually, that wasn't LAT. That was a post-election audit. There were observers who were seeing unintentional errors being made, but they couldn't say anything. We would just wanted to clarify the rule that in an orderly way, if observers see an error, they are to speak up, and that error is to be corrected on the spot. Also, when recounts are being conducted, all of the candidates on the ballot need to be notified. All the candidates that whose races are being recounted need to be notified. So those were the two changes that we've made since May. And I know at the May hearing, you all said you had more questions. So now I'd love to answer your questions if I could.
Any questions from the board? Resolve? No? Member Johnson?
Sure. So Ms. Marks, how do we know that machine counts are more accurate if we cannot read the QR code?
Machines count. We're talking about counting what is presented for it to count. Machines are accurate, more accurate than we humans are at counting what's programmed for it to count. But of course, what a manual recount does is try to make sure that the best record we have of voters' intent is actually counted.
Right.
I'm certainly not defending QR codes if that's what you're asking me to do.
Right. So to be clear, hand counts are the backup method of counting when the machines are broken. So there must be some degree of confidence in hand counting if that is our backup method. And hand counting actually can be better than machine counting depending on the settings on the machine reading. So if the machine is set to be very specific about that colored in oval on hand marked ballots, if the settings are too high, it will reject the ballot and count it as a no vote. So the setting of machine reading is critical in regarding the accuracy of machine counting. Is that true?
Well, absolutely it is. And there's so many variables that you can't really program for. that when we have a really close election, that the ground truth is to be found in a hand count and a manual examination of that ballot.
Correct. And when machines are used to, even optical character recognition software is used to read ballots, the ballots that are thrown out or are unable to be read, they go to humans to read the real intent of the voter of the ballot.
If the machine recognizes that it's not reading it.
If the machine
Right.
recognizes
For
it.
example, if you use red ink, most types of red ink to mark your ballot, it won't read it at all. And it doesn't know that it's not reading it, so it won't be kicked out. Only with a human inspection will you see that you've got valid votes there that are not being counted. So you cannot rely on the machine to check itself in that way.
Right. Your petition is an interesting petition, but it seems to me that it sort of pits both methods of counting against each other. And to be informative to the group here, we should all know that most European countries